It's very, very important that as teachers, we have a thorough understanding of what racism is. It could be one of the more defining elements that has shaped the thought and the intellect of this country. It's been in the news, it's been in the courts, it's been in our homes, it's been in our neighborhoods. It's one of the defining elements that correlates with poverty, and on and on and on and on. So racism is a very, very significant element in our culture, and thus it's a very significant element in the realm of education. One way to understand racism is to consider the ways in which policies and practices of institutions help to create and maintain differential outcomes and stresses for people who are categorized in different racial groups. I want you to think about this for a minute. And we're going to go back to this a couple times. When we're talking about oppression, we're not talking about specific realms of oppression for specific categories. Because the term oppression is oppression, and it means the same thing across categories. Oppression is oppression, oppression is bad. There are different elements that lead to oppression that you can categorize to different peoples. The stereotype of alcoholism for Indian people might be an oppressive mechanism that helps, or hurts for that matter, but that keeps people of Indian culture, of Indian heritage, of the Indian race down. If people keep believing in the stereotypes of all Indians are alcoholics, then we're going to have a problem because everybody's going to think that all Indians are alcoholics. Think about this. Everybody in here has some privilege attached to them. And I can prove that very, very simply. Imagine for a minute that you're blind. A person of disabilities. You're a blind person of disabilities. If you're blind, there's no way that you can see that picture. There's no way you can see the picture. Thus, if you're not blind, you have a very, very distinct privilege. The privilege of being able to see that picture. So there's no refuting it. You cannot refute it. If you can't see that picture, you can't see that picture. If you are confined to a wheelchair, you cannot climb those steps unless they invent some kind of wheelchair that enables you to climb steps that I don't know about. But you cannot do that. Thus, the people who can have a very, very distinct privilege. They can climb those steps. There's no refuting it. When we're talking about oppression, we're talking about the oppression of all of those that encompass what we call, in diversity, the isms. Sexism, racism, and ableism or disableism, and so on and so forth. There are certain advantages to being a man that women don't have. Access into the locker rooms of the golf courses is one of them, I can tell you that. It gives me opportunity to talk under that setting, a relaxed setting, a setting that many, many men adhere to. It gives me a distinct advantage to get things done. I already pointed out the one about Indians and about race, right? If somebody stumbles out of a bar drunk, you are going to say, look at that drunk Indian or look at that drunk black guy versus look at that drunk guy. I know you will. The surveys say that it's true almost 100% of the time. And by the way, that study was done one by one, person by person. It was a qualitative study, great study too. So there are very definite privileges that some of us have. Those are heavy burdens to carry. If you're blind and you live in a world where you're expected to see everything that happens, that's a big issue. In its present form, can you text? Not that I know of. You can listen to the computer. A lot of the articles that we have now are voice articles. That helps. But it's a definite advantage. If you're walking down the hall and somebody as a chair in front of you, you're probably not gonna see it unless you feel it with your cane. But that's a burden too, you have to carry the cane, right? Maybe you have a C and I dog, whatever the case might be. It's even a burden to have to read Braille. I tried reading Braille one time. But it was really hard. I couldn't get it. I really admire people who can read Braille because it's not that easy. Anybody here read Braille? Anybody here have someone in their family who's sightless? Nobody? Do you? Economic condition is also a privilege. If you can afford gas, that's a huge privilege, right? Most of you in here, I'm sure, being students, probably have struggled from time to time affording to put gas in the car. When I was your age, I did. I was borrowing money constantly from my parents. That's some gas money, get out of my face. Why, as a nation, why as a society do we allow oppression to occur? We can continue to make progress to make everybody's life easier. In terms of your students, you're going to have some students with learning disabilities. You have to, as a teacher, try to make their experience in your classroom as good as everybody else's. That's the law, by the way. The reason people are on IEPs is because it's important to supply the best educational services possible for all students. One of the reasons why we got to learn this class is because there's a heavy Indian population in South Dakota. It's about 12% of the population. Thus, inevitably, you're going to have people in your classroom who you're probably not that familiar with in terms of learning styles, teaching styles, culture. It's important. Somebody has to make up that gap. The third issue is to consider who benefits from things as they are. And what have been the consequences for groups and individuals who try to change the racial status quo? Many people find racism as prejudice and power. You have to be in power in order for the issue to be classified as an ism. Black people, Indian people, Chinese people cannot be racist. They can be prejudiced, and my father, by the way, was very prejudiced. They can be prejudiced, but they can't be racist. You can be racist against your own people, however, but that's a whole different set of issues. You can be prejudiced, which leads to discrimination, but you can't be racist. You have to have power. By definition, you have to have power to qualify as that ism. In other words, privilege. Privilege equals power. What does prejudice mean? Remember the definitions? Prejudice was one of them. What does prejudice mean?
What do you think about something?
Yeah, it means to prejudge. Literally. Prejudge is the root of prejudice. To prejudge. Now, we need to judge people, right? We don't want to be lured into the Ku Klux Klan. So we've got to make judgments about situations, and we do make judgments every single day. It's important to make good judgments. The thing we don't want to do is make prejudgments based on stereotypes. It would be ideal if I had a magic Kool-Aid that I could have everybody in here drink, that when you left, you erased your mind of all prejudice. But that's not going to happen. Everybody came here from a different place. Everybody's had, probably most of your cases, 18, 19, 20, 21 years of experience under their belt. As a consequence, a lot of your ideas have been formed, at least the root of your ideas have been formed. And they got formed because of the churches you go to, because of the schools that you went to, because of your family, because of your friends, because of your neighborhood, because of your geographic location, because of your economic status. All those things have contributed to who you are sitting here today. If things would have been different in the past, you'd be a different person sitting here. And there's no way that I can expect everybody to just erase everything from their head. That's unrealistic. You can't do that. That's silly. But what we can do is we can get the dispositional attitude that we've taken and we've discussed throughout this course over and over and over and over again. Things like empathy, things like sympathy, things like the simple dispositions that teachers should have. Usually I can tell if somebody's going to be a super teacher 5 minutes after talking to them. You can tell. They've got that, whatever it is, in them. Usually pretty outgoing. Usually a little bit bubbly. Very enthused about becoming a teacher is very important. People who aren't enthused about teaching probably aren't supposed to be teaching. In your case, most of you are secondary ed students. You've got something else, a more defined notion of what you want to do in mind. If you're history or math or reading or whatever the case might be, you're passionate about something. I can tell that when I'm around teachers, I can usually tell who the teachers in the room are by the way they dress, by the way they carry themselves, by the way they talk, all those kinds of things. So those are kind of the dispositional attitudes that it takes to be a good teacher. You know, you don't see a lot of pre-service teachers breaking the law. Well, you can't break the law, right? If you get caught doing that, your teaching career is over and you've wasted all this money. That's not good. Teachers usually get along very well with children. I mean, come on. I hate kids. So those are the kinds of things that you have to start thinking about. Do you have all those dispositions? Have you come face to face in this course with some of the issues that you brought to the course? I've tried my best to this point so far to get you there, at least face it a couple of times with dissidence, with insulting South Dakota, with insulting the country. By the way, I don't think anything I've said here is untrue. See, there I go again, right? I'm trying to get you to a place, to help you get to that place. But you have to think about those things. When the Constitution of this country was written, I'm sure that the founding fathers, and they were fathers, there were no mothers there, but the founding fathers of this country probably didn't have this in mind. Which really makes me think about whether or not we should be completely revamping things like our Constitution. At least bringing them up to date a little bit. We don't carry muskets anymore. We don't have to quickly assemble an army anymore. There's all kinds of issues that need to be considered. Some of those issues are personal to a lot of people. Maybe if we revamp them, maybe we should include thinking about women. That wasn't part of it. Maybe we should think about adding something about African Americans, American Indians, who weren't considered human beings at that time. But if we don't, institutionally, we've created barriers for women, African Americans, American Indians, and so on and so forth. You can't keep the same rules and expect the game to change. That's a big part of the message that I've tried to get across throughout this course. As teachers of history, as teachers of reading, whatever the case might be, we have to start looking at our subject matter and determining what is best for the situation in which we live. That's what lots of scholars refer to as white privilege. A term that lots of quote-unquote white people don't like because it focuses too much on quote-unquote white people. But it's just a term. What they're talking about are the power elites. And the people with the most privilege. So if we take everybody in the whole world and line everybody up and give everybody like a matrix, or within the confines of a matrix, a little dot. Some people are going to have a long line of dots, and some people are going to have very few dots. Some people never have a problem getting an apartment. Some people do. Some people get followed in stores, some people don't. Somebody came up to me one time and said, you know, they were obviously staring at me. I was in a cafeteria, and it was right before I was going to do a speech. This was at UCLA. And they were staring at me. And it was very uncomfortable, to say the least. I'm not used to getting stared at that much. And they came over, and they looked at me, and they said that, this is the question they asked, which I thought was interesting. They said, I'm always wondering what Indian people are thinking when they're around white people. Can you tell me? And I went, holy crap. You know, right now I'm thinking about going to get another cupcake. But then I started thinking about it, you know? I'm sure that everybody in here has thought about that at one time. Not necessarily about Indians, but about somebody. Now, I wonder how a black person feels being the only black person over in the muck on a crowded Monday afternoon. Internalized racism describes one set of ways in which systems of oppression act on people of color. For example, how people of color are supported for maintaining silence about racism and punished for speaking or acting in opposition. Unfortunately, it was my burden to tell you about this stuff this semester. I don't think it would have been as effective if a white guy would have been here telling you about Indian stuff. The other side of that is there's a certain level of subjectivity from your parts about having me stand here and tell you stuff. It's inherent, it's built in. I expect it. It's part of the psychological process of figuring out how to teach this course. It's a subject throughout everything that I talk about. It's in every lecture. It's in every video. It's in every single thing I say. Believe it or not, this is an incredibly laid out class. And I had to think about making adjustments. I have to think about that all the time. One of the reasons why I think conferences are beneficial, as I told most of you in the conference, is it kind of breaks the ice a little bit. And I know that you're uncomfortable going in there. You don't know what to expect. Who's he going to ask questions? Is this a test? God, I'm actually in here with a closed door with an Indian guy. What do I know about this guy? What's that small writing on the board back there? Geez, he's got a nice bookcase. Must read something. Actually, I had somebody tell me that. Gary, you got a nice bookcase here. Oh, well, thanks. You must read something. Occasionally. I worry that many people, when I teach classes, think that I'm arrogant. In full disclosure, I have to be a little bit. I have to be. If I lose control of this class, I don't get it back. You're going to find, the females especially, going to find out, especially from 5th grade on up, that if you lose control of the boys in your classes, you're going to have a tough time getting it back. It's a very difficult thing to do. But when I use that in a lecture like I am today, one of the things that it does is it takes your interpretation of what it is to be an Indian professor and breaks it down one step. Because I want you to know that I know that. What about all the rules here? One of the things that I find really frustrating in terms of thinking about race in my department, number one, I think there's only 2 racial minorities in our entire School of Ed. Just 2. We've got a couple ethnic minorities. Most women know when there's sexist remarks being said around them, right? And guys don't have a clue. We're stupid when it comes to sexism, because we've been raised in a world that teaches us to be aggressive. My grandson, he's a great little kid. My daughter took him down the Barbie aisle at Target and started putting stuff in there that was girl stuff. You know what he was doing? Throwing it out. Where did he learn that anyway? He was a year old. Well, he was 15 months. Where did he learn that?
Grandpa?
Probably. Till he came to my house and saw my Barbie collection. When I was a kid, my brother, we used to have these, back then we had a thing called Johnny West, right? They were like the wrestling figures, only they were cowboy and Indian figures. We always, even Indian kids, we wanted to be the cowboys. And there was a Jane West, right? I don't know why, but my brother was obsessed with getting Jane West. Now I'm starting to think about it. Anyway, we'll save that for another day. Institutional racism is all around us, as I was saying. I feel very isolated. And again, this is part of the transparency that I promised you, because it can benefit you greatly in your careers. I feel very, very isolated in my department a lot, because there's nobody that I can relate to. And I had somebody I could relate to. His name was Dr. Valandra over in the Indian Studies Department, but he's gone now. And oddly, we used to end up together all the time. It's not even that we were really looking for, we had the same things to talk about, right? Did you ever get in these awkward situations, maybe you're on a date or something, and by the time you get to the Mexican Viejo and you're just eating dinner, you figure out that you have nothing in common with this person? Well, what do you talk about, right? So can we invite both of our friends over at the same time? It gets a little awkward, you know what I mean? Lots of people don't have those burdens, especially when they cross racial lines, because the not drinking means more, because that's a burden that I have to carry. I don't have a choice. A lot of times when we do things, that's why we're down in Sioux City. Not to mention they actually have things in Sioux City. Can't even buy a pair of men's shoes in this town without going to Walmart. In a town of, like, I think it's 11,000 people, can't buy men's shoes anywhere? It's kind of sad though. Isn't that privilege? Think about that for a minute. Why do students flee on the weekends? Because there's nothing to do, right? Well, you don't have to pay to do laundry at home, right?
Literally.
And there's always a hot meal there.
Hot showers.
And showers you can take by yourself. So as teachers, one of the things that we should constantly be thinking about is how we can make a difference. How we can fill the gaps between here and here. Between those that don't have, those that do have, between the haves and the have-nots, right? As teachers, we should be thinking on those lines all the time. You're constantly going to have to be assessing your students. Why is this student only at 25%, this one at 85%? Well, your duty as a teacher is to figure out how to get the student at 25% up to 60%, right? You're trying to close that gap. And that's becoming more and more important, of course, with this kind of quantitative teaching that a lot of school districts have to do now. Teaching to tests, teaching for scores. You don't get this score, you don't get funding. You don't get funding, you close your school, kind of thing. And we send all the kids to other schools when we create overcrowded classrooms, and then they don't reach the levels, and we have to close those. It goes on and on and on. Cultural racism specifically refers to the behaviors that reflect a worldview that overtly and covertly attributes value and normality to the privileged, which in the United States are white heterosexual Christian males. That's who has the most dots behind their name, folks. One of the things that I know happens when I go places and do lectures is there's always this kind of prejudicial attitude. Yeah, here comes Cheeseman again. He's going to start griping about white male privilege. Yada, 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 yada. Give me a handkerchief and make me young. And people shut down, right? So you try to create an atmosphere that's a little bit different than they expect. And it kind of holds them, just like you do as teachers, right? If you're going to teach about the Civil War, everybody's going to think, boring, boring, boring. Who needs to know about the Civil War? After all, it happened already. That'd be something. We have courses about history. We don't have many courses about the future. Or do we? Right? If history is taught right, it tells us about the future. Different perspectives. So you spend your night at home pacing, figuring out a different way to present the Civil War. What's going to show your audience that it's not the same old boring crap that you thought it would be? Which is, by the way, prejudging, right? Cultural racism devalues in its stereotypes, and it labels people. You saw Victor in that film. They drive my kids nuts because at home I don't say film, I say film. But we saw Victor get really upset and emotional because he's frustrated with having to explain the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. He doesn't understand why people don't get it. Then we saw the other guy continually deny Victor's right to see things his way. Why don't you just come over here, he said 4 times. You're blocking your own progress. It's all your fault. Well, racism is not the fault of people of color. Not at all. It's like sexism is not the fault of women. It's not the woman's fault if a man beats on her because he's got more arm strength. So we've got institutional racism, we've got cultural racism, and we've got individual racism. What that refers to, as it says on here, is it refers to the beliefs, attitudes, and actions of individuals that support and perpetuate racism. You've heard the phrase that if we're not part of the solution, we're part of the problem. That truly is an accurate statement. If you're in a classroom and you allow racist behavior to happen from student to student, you're perpetuating the classroom. Anybody here see the movie Bully? One of the instances is about Sioux City, and there's a principal down there who perpetuates bullying, a vice principal. And she's been getting hate mail like you wouldn't believe and death threats because of what was exposed on the movie. But the same thing holds true with racism. Because racism is bullying. Sexism is bullying. Bullying is about the person in power taking advantage of their power and leaving those who aren't empowered in a lesser state. Isn't that bullying? It is. Surprise, surprise, right? I told you, we're going to make connections you haven't thought of before. How many people in here have been bullied? All of you have, you should have your hands up. Everybody's been bullied. Whether it's by a sister, by an older brother, or somebody, boss. a professor. Racism, sexism, ableism, it's about bullying. Bullying is about power and control. Racism is about power and control. Ableism is about power and control. Sexism is about power and control. Racism is about power and control. Ableism is about power and control. When I bring that up, a lot of times people will openly say that, wow, I never thought about it that way. That's exactly what it is. And what's troubling is nobody likes to be bullied. I know people right now who are economically bullied. There's lots of different ways to do it. And nobody likes it. It's frustrating. I've seen people brought to their knees on a playground. A kid bullying someone to the point where they couldn't stop shaking. It hurt so bad. I know a little kid who had acne problems, 7th grader, severe acne. He was bullied to the point of bringing a gun to school. He had had enough. And unfortunately, it didn't play out well. He had enough. But we blame him for the issues. I wonder what would have happened if he wouldn't have been bullied. Probably nothing. It's the disenfranchised who get bullied. The people who feel emotionally, intellectually, and physically inadequate. I don't know why people care about other people so much. You know what I mean? I mean, that sounds like a harsh statement and a negative statement, but why do we care? Why do we care how other people live, as long as they live good, right? If somebody wants to live a different alternative lifestyle, so be it. Who cares? Do it. Do what makes you happy, right? If you want to watch Duck Dynasty, do it. If you're smart, don't. No, I'm just kidding. You can tell that show's so reversed. They say it's not scripted. There comes a point when enough's enough. And that's where Victor was. That's why he was so emotional. How many times do we have to explain the same thing over and over and over and over again until finally people get it? Why should anybody in this country be more privileged than somebody else? One time somebody says, well, you know, they shouldn't have a color TV, they're on welfare. What? Yeah. They haven't earned this big screen TV. Well, think about this. What does that mean anyway? Is the only gauge in our society that we have money? Who says they haven't earned a big screen TV? Just because they can't afford it? Maybe they work in the soup kitchen every day. Maybe that's the gauge in which we should use. But all we do is use money, right? Oh, you can't have a new car because you can't afford it. Why not give people new cars, huh? Why don't the poor deserve a car? Just because you make more money? What is money? Money is a monetary system. Does that make somebody better than somebody else? Does that make them more righteous than somebody else? What is that? Well, in this country, we've been trained to think that money is the end-all for everything. As teachers, you're going to find out that it's not about money. And if it is about money being a teacher, you're in the wrong field. You'll make a living, but not a whole lot more. So why is it that people get down on the poor? They don't deserve this, they don't deserve... Not long ago, we were in Coon Rapids. Somebody walked in, I was with somebody who I didn't particularly care for. They were actually taking me out to dinner to apologize for some things, which I wasn't accepting, by the way. And somebody walked in who was dressed very, very poorly. What are they doing here? I said enough. I went over, paid the waitress and left. Because that's the reason I didn't get along with them, right? Who's to say that they can't eat at the expensive restaurants? Just because they don't have money? I mean, I know people who are raising 6, 7 kids alone. What gives Donald Trump his power? You take away his money, and he's a bum on the streets. Nobody respects him. What is it about that? Why do we think that way? Why do we think we can't have nice things just because we can't afford them? What gives people with money the privilege to have nice things and to scoff at people who don't have them? What is that about? Is that bullying? We have a terrible sense of values. Feel a little bit of dissonance there? And that we judge everything through a monetary matrix. I don't get it. What makes, who's the guy in Nebraska, the rich guy? What makes Warren Buffett better than anybody else? Why does Warren Buffett have so much control over the stock market? Whenever Warren Buffett raises his hands, the stock market just trembles. But what makes him better than you? And what's your definition by way of better? He might be richer. A lot of rich people have never earned a cent. A thing called inheritance. What makes them better than you? Do they deserve to have a bigger TV than you do? Do they deserve to eat 3 meals a day all the time and you only 2? Think about this. Why has this issue never been brought up throughout your educational career? Because we're supposed to think that money is the end all. Because we're a capital society. When are we going to start thinking about good for the sake of good instead of good for the sake of rich? It's very hard for one person to control an entire group. You're not going to go out and stand out in front of the muck and say, nobody's going to discriminate anymore. The only thing that you can do is control you. You can't do anything more than that. You can try to influence other people. You can do what I do and try to educate other people. You can do all that, and you will probably be successful. But the fact of the matter is when it comes right down to it, if you want the world to be a better place, then you've got to change you. Whenever I say the word change, people get antsy. What do you mean change? Why do I gotta change? I'm not saying you have to. But as teachers, that's certainly something that you're doing every single time you step into a classroom. You're trying to change something. If you're teaching reading, you're changing somebody by teaching them the next step in the reading level, right? You're changing people's perception of history by teaching history, of math by teaching math, and on and on and on and on. Teachers are change agents. That's what you do. So nobody should know more about it than you. But there's a certain percentage of teachers out there who know nothing about it. So, what I want you to do now, I'd like to hear some examples of how you have thought about things different since you've been in this course. And I don't have to call on people. If you're very, very perceptive, you're going to realize that this is a pure learning opportunity. We have people hearing from the people around you, and it's a flimsy attempt for me to add one more layer on the thought process that is happening in this course environment.
Okay.
When I did my interview, I actually had to interview my dad because, like, my grandparents aren't, I don't know, they're not all with it. So they have good days and bad days, and when I was home, it was a bad day. But
I
just
can
like
relate.
talking about like the bullying and stuff, in my interview with my dad, he had talked about it, and he said like it didn't happen as horrible as back then that he remembered, because he said like normally when like you had your group of off kids and then you had, you know, whoever, and if they would like watch over them kind of, they didn't really allow it to happen. They would like, I don't know, fight back for them. So it wasn't as bad as it is now. And he said, I don't know, his perception of it was more of like the discipline at home. Like if they did something bad in school, they were more afraid to go home than to have consequences at school because the parents were more strict and not allowing of it.
I got spanked when I was in second grade. That tells you how long ago, second grade. They actually, the teachers spanking kids. I got spanked a lot.
It's just kinda like what we've got from this class, so.
Tell me about some of the ways that your perception has changed since you've been in here.
I wouldn't say my personal perception of things has changed, because I always felt that I was pretty open to different cultures and different ideas and different lifestyles, but it definitely opened my eyes about my parents, who I would consider to be non-accepting of things. They say a lot of racial comments as I was growing up, and really rude remarks about people that I would hang out with that weren't white. And even small things, like you say, like when most people, when they see somebody stumbling out of the bar, they're gonna, you know, talk about those specific identifiers that go along with them. And my parents are definitely those types of people, which really, it kind of blew my mind listening to your lectures and realizing that they're exactly who you're describing, and it makes me wonder how I ended up not becoming like them.
What's interesting too is each of us have a deep personal relationship to our parents, and you want to be like them. You want to, you know, if they're Lutheran, well, a lot of us do. Lots of grandparents, because of the era that they grew up in, great-grandparents say lots of silly racial things. Because first off, the phraseology was different back then. We've just come a long way since then.
I get in a lot of arguments with my grandma, and she talks about colored people, and doesn't really go over so well with me, and we end up getting in fights. She don't really like them.
Yes.
I was just gonna say, like, my idea of like privilege has like, I mean, like opening me up to the fact that like I do have like a lot of privileges, and like most of the time like you would think like, oh, like a small town person from South Dakota, a lot of privilege, but like when you like think in comparison to like when you really like open up your worldview and don't just think in like regards to like this country, but when you think like other countries, like you're like, I'm privileged beyond belief, you know?
Most people in this world don't have a phone or a TV. A third of the people in this world don't have electricity. Think about that. What do we take advantage of? When I left the house, I left the TV on. Well, my dog watches Criminal Minds.
I have two things. One of the things that really kind of struck me was like the whole eye contact thing, that it's a sign of respect. And I was kind of talking about that with my interview. My mom was holding the camera for me, and she actually taught out in Rapid City around the aerospace, the aircraft place out there.
Well,
Yeah, that one. Sorry.
Well, lots and lots of nuclear weapons are stored, by the way.
Mm-hmm. And she had no idea that that was a sign of respect. And like she was just like, and she taught a lot of, she's an elementary school teacher, and she had no idea that that was a sign of respect. And it kind of baffled me that she just didn't know that that's what was going on, and she always thought that they just wouldn't look at her at all that way. And it was just, it was weird. And then the other thing was the whole walking out, somebody stumbling out of a bar thing, and I realized something that I do to stereotype people, and how you were saying, like, when a white person would come out of a bar, instantly in my mind, I went, that's a bro. Not, that's a white person or a white guy, I went, that's a bro. And I immediately stereotyped them to being bro-like instead of being a person, and it was just an eye-opening experience for me.
It makes me, like, after everything and just hearing everything, it makes me, like, want to go out and do more stuff and, like, get out of that comfort zone. I remember you gave that speech before about how, like, people, like, you're forced to get out of your comfort zone and and, like, when you teach this class and stuff like that, but at the same time, it makes me kind of want to go do the same thing, like, I don't know, I've always been, like, one of those people that, like, wants to experience life to the fullest, and then, like, I guess I never really, like, had, like, the urge to do that until, like, now, where it's, like, I want to go, like, experience stuff that, I don't know, like, kind of like an adrenaline junkie, but not, like, for adrenaline, like, just, like, going and doing stuff that I, like, would never experience usually, like, on a normal basis, so.
We're gonna have an
It
in-class.
was kind of a positive.
Shortly, we're gonna have an in-class activity about making your own bucket list.
I did that last year.
Are we gonna watch the movie too?
No.
Thought I'd try. I thought it was really interesting, primarily the way we think in Western society is through dichotomies, the way the relationship between oppressor and oppressed peoples. It's a top-down thing that we often in terms view it very, it is almost a natural given hierarchy in European thought, and I thought it was really interesting when we talked about the metaphysics of the drum and the teleology, rather as a circle rather than two distinct poles, but something that is kind of like a sustaining ecosystem rather than the dialectics or something always crashing or having contact that way, but rather in a circular progression. I thought that was very interesting.
This class and the one where we talked about East and West River, South Dakota, when we watched the movie, like, especially brought up a memory of how racist my grandmother really is. She's from the more rural part of the state, and it brought back a memory where we were at a club basketball tournament. I was one of 2 white kids on the team, and the rest were African American or Native American people. And she came up to me after the game, and she wasn't being quiet about it. She's like, "Why do you have so many colored people on your team?" And she used a different word, and it took about a year for me to gain my teammates' respect back because of her comment.
This is more of a question. In the case of, like, parents being racist, how would you handle that as a teacher in the classroom, trying to, promote equality and understanding and keep your learning environment safe for everybody, even though that what the parents preach at home might be different?
Well, we're gonna get into that. That's part of the next session. If you don't handle things in a stern way, you're enabling. And I don't think there's anything worse you can do to a kid than enable them. And I'm speaking as a parent.
Are we gonna be talking about, like, the same thing, like, about the bullying, so, like, if it happens, I mean, there's so many different ways to look at it, like, you could, I don't know, these kids are extremely mean, and so if you step in and do something about it, it could just provoke them to keep doing it and do it worse, even though they know they're gonna get in trouble for doing it.
If you watch that movie Bullying, there's the vice principals, the assistant principals doing that and making things worse.